Welcome back to the Crypto Business Forum. I'm Leisha West, and I am incredibly excited to introduce to you our featured speaker. We are live at NASDAQ right here in the heart of Times Square. She is one of the best-known blockchain and cryptocurrency lawyers in the world. Recognized by Chambers and Partners as one of the top 12 blockchain and cryptocurrency lawyers globally, she co-founded and has led, since its inception, MoFo's Global Blockchain plus Smart Contracts Group, which she currently co-chairs, which includes over 70 lawyers. She is the chair of the prominent Wall Street Blockchain Alliance Legal Working Group and is a member of the Global Wharton RegTech think tank. In addition, she has been appointed by the Delaware Secretary of State to serve on Delaware's Blockchain Strategy Committee, founded the Blockchain Legislation Project, and frequently speaks with regulators from around the world regarding blockchain, smart contracts, and cryptocurrency matters. She works collaboratively with blockchain leaders from other law firms, clients, and the broader community to advance the industry, anticipate and address regulatory concerns, and seize strategic opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor. Please make welcome Josh Claman.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me here. So today we're going to talk about token sales, which is one of my favorite topics, as you might imagine. I'm sure it's probably one of your favorites or least favorites right now too. So just to have everyone be on the same page for a moment, I'm going to spend just a minute just level setting to try and make sure that everyone is aware of what blockchain is and what digital tokens are. So I realize this is a review for a lot of you. So if you think of a global database running on millions of computers, this is a highly non-technical explanation, but if you imagine everyone looking in at the same golden copy, everybody is looking at the same exact version of something. That's the idea behind blockchain in a sense. There's trust where you ordinarily might need a third-party intermediary that you trust. But there's trust here because everybody can see the exact same copy. There's not a version stored on someone's database and then another entry stored on someone else's database. It's just one. So now if you pull back for a second, and instead of thinking of the global database, you think of a block of data. And then you think of a series of blocks of data that are linked. And each successive block contains all of the information in each preceding block. Blockchain. The idea being that you can't go back in time if you're a bad actor or a good actor generally, and change information earlier in the blockchain because all of the information has already been contained in each succeeding block. So through cryptography and other means, it is secure generally. Okay, I like to throw in generally there because I'm a lawyer. Now, digital tokens, I'm not going to go into what smart contracts are and the various use cases for blockchain, because we're here for token sales, basically. Now, digital tokens, there's so much in the news these days, and there's so much controversy about what they are. Now, when I first started getting into this space, I started thinking about coins, right, or actual tokens. My mind went there, even though I knew it wasn't really that. I was thinking of like little Chuck E. Cheese tokens or the tokens you get in a video game arcade. But really, the better way to think of this is as a string of numbers on a digital distributed ledger. So if you think of it rather than as a thing, if you think of it as, say, your credit card number, then you can start to see why there are so many variations on what people think they are. Now, as we'll see a little later, the SEC has repeatedly said, or at least members of the SEC have repeatedly said, that many of these, or all of these, depending on whom you talk to, are securities or likely to be securities. But if you think of it in terms of rather Microsoft Office or something like that, some big box software that you bring home and you install, the first thing you have to do is put in your key, right? It's a string of letters or numbers. So that's why sometimes when people talk about digital tokens, they might say, oh, it's like a license. It's like a software license because you're putting in strings of numbers, right? Alternatively, you could have other things. Sometimes it might be I could have a string of numbers and say, whoever has this string of numbers is going to get $5 from me. Or whoever holds this string of numbers is going to get a vote. Or whoever has this string of numbers is going to be able to access this ecosystem that I built and have a membership. It could also be that whoever has the lowest number is first in line for something. Or I could be auctioning something off, and every X number wins. There are myriad ways that you can play with these numbers, and that's what's important to remember here, is that there is no monolithic token, and hence there is no monolithic token sale, right? Okay, so these charts are not even remotely accurate, but they're basically shown to highlight two different kinds of tokens. And I just want to stop for a moment and say, okay, Bitcoin and Ether. Sometimes those are referred to as cryptocurrencies. And so then it gets a little confusing. Well, what's the difference between a cryptocurrency and a token, a digital token? Well, digital token is the generic term. So they're all digital tokens. These altcoins that you talk about, those are also digital tokens. But not every digital token is a cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency isn't a real thing. It's just what we tend to call certain of them that are popular and that are used for a store of value. So this is just to show that there has been great growth and tremendous volatility, I'll say, in the past year. Now I'm just going to hop through some interesting, I think, statistics. In 2016, all told, there was about 256 million raised. Now, about 150 million of this was from the DAO, and we'll touch upon the DAO a little later. For now, we'll just say its marketing efforts were better, perhaps, than its technology through a smart contract vulnerability. Immediately after raising about 150 million in digital currency, about 50 million of it was taken by a bad actor. This led eventually to the hard fork in Ethereum, which is why we now have what we call Ethereum, and then we have this parallel universe, so to speak, called Ethereum Classic that still has that theft. But the important thing for this is everybody got their money back. So when this will become relevant later. When we subtract out that 150 million, we get to about 96.4 million that was raised in token sales in 2016. And these were the top 10. Now, 2017 was quite different. Oh, and I should say nearly 500 million was raised in venture capital in 2016 in the same types of entities. And in 2017, by mid-year, they had already surpassed, in terms of token sales, the amount that had been raised in VC funding. So you can see some statistics there. You'll note that the tie dates are October. I don't think that's actually accurate. I think the tie dates just weren't updated on the websites after October, because people generally say that about 4 billion was raised. And 4 billion was not raised by October 16th as far as I know. But I put these up there to be accurate, or as accurate as I can be. But what you'll see is that there's tremendously more that happened in 2017. No surprise, right? And what's really interesting, though, is if you compare 2016 and 2017, remember, in all of 2016, if you subtract out the DAO, 96.4 million was raised. Well, that is less than the number 6 token sale of 2017. So in 2017, the sizes of the token sales, the amounts raised, got tremendously larger. And if you actually look at how the price of Bitcoin and Ether rose during the year, in some cases, these went up tremendously. Of course, you have to adjust for the downward trend that we've been seeing a little bit more recently. But there's still, many of them have significantly more than was reflected in their initial raise. Okay, so now this is what I call the Shark Tank moment, okay? I always think when I watch that show, because it's one of my favorites, whenever people make a deal, they're very excited. And then they rush off stage, and then I sort of nudge whoever's sitting next to me and I say, this is the lawyer in me, oh, now the negotiations are going to start, right? You're going to be giving up this right, they're going to have a veto right on this, now the lawyers come in, right? But what if they didn't have to? What if, well, I mean, of course the lawyers have to come in, right? Because I'm a lawyer. But what if you didn't have to give up control? What if you didn't have to be diluted unless you wanted to? What if you didn't have to give up veto rights unless you wanted to? What if you didn't have to give up an income stream or a profit right unless you wanted to? And what if instead of going to the same investors that you always went to in VC, right? What if you could expand it in certain cases to include retail investors as well? Well, some people started thinking about this, and token sales were looking very attractive. Now, some other differences is in some token sales, not all, and I'll talk about some of what I'm seeing in the market lately. In some token sales, there's very little diligence. It might just be a simple white paper. And of course, white papers, there's no monolithic white paper or platonic ideal of a white paper either, right? Some have very little information, some are quite robust. But what if you could do that? And what if instead of having to negotiate contracts, you could have a smart contract that automatically executed, right? And it was a take it or leave it. You say, hey, this is what I want if you want my altcoin, and people deliver or they don't. So there's a lot of differences here, but you can see why token sales may be very, very attractive. So I've covered a lot of what's on this slide, but I just want to say one important thing on here is the digital tokens may be securities even if they have utility, some non-incidental utility. And I'll get into that a little bit more, but I just want to keep repeating that because I think in the past year, we got into the habit, many of us, of talking about utility tokens versus security tokens. And the thing is that tokens can have utility and they can still be securities. There's no bright line test that determines when a digital token would not be a security. So here are just some of the things. I'm not going to run through it. You can see it on the screen. But basically, if you hear me say token sale or token generation event, which I probably won't say because it's kind of long, they're the same thing. The same thing as an ICO. Okay, these are all the same things. Same thing if I say an app token or a utility token, they're meant to be the same things. And a security token, if I say that, that is a token, that is a security. Okay, utility tokens. So this was the rage in 2017, was to say that everything was a utility token, just about. And a good friend of mine developed a memo that had a few different examples of what non-incidental utility might look like in the token sale context. I won't go through this, but as we'll get to in a moment, just remember, in bold, even a token with utility can still be a security. And even if it's fully functional at the moment of sale. Now, functional is a gray area, of course. It's software we're talking about, but it still can be a security even if it's ready to go and to use. So security tokens, I'm not going to go through all this. Some of them look like traditional securities, like equity or debt securities, but as I'll explain in a moment, there are also cases in which you could accidentally sell a security. And under the SEC's views, all quote-unquote ICOs have borne the hallmarks of security offerings, even if the relevant founders have not intended them to be. That was not a full quote on that, but part of it was. Okay, so this is a quick fly through two of what I think are the major, they're not cases, but the major tests, right, that the SEC has shown us. So the first one is our old friend, the Dow. So this thing was having lots of problems, as we now know, and it continued to have problems last summer. Okay, so we saw a lot of token sales in the early part of 2017. And what I, in my practice, often heard from people, and also just, in the real world, heard from people was, well, we can do that. The Dow did it, right? When you'd say, oh, that might be a security that you've got there, they'd say, well, no one has stopped the Dow. Well, so someone stopped the Dow. All right, so the good thing about the Dow and what was helpful about this is that, remember, the Dow was already out of business. Nobody was hurt. Everybody gave back their money. So this was a perfect case for the SEC to kind of give instructive guidance without necessarily punishing anyone. So what did they do? They said a few things. They said, number one, the Howey test, the test that determines whether something is an investment contract applies. So you check to see whether there's an investment of money in a common enterprise with a reasonable expectation of profit based solely or primarily on the managerial or entrepreneurial efforts of others. That is a mouthful. Okay, so what else did it say? Well, the Dow was a Swiss foundation, it's sold all over the world, and it's sold to retail investors. And so what we learned from the Dow enforcement action was no matter where in the world you launch your token sale from, if you're selling to U.S. persons, U.S. securities law matters. One thing that the Dow report also said that maybe not everyone saw, although I'm betting some of the exchanges noticed, was they also said that the platform on which the Dow token was traded, that those were securities exchanges, and that they should have registered as national securities exchanges or as alternative trading systems or some other exemption from registration, right, broker-dealer. That is perhaps why when you go onto an exchange serving U.S. persons, there's not typically a big supply of different kinds of tokens you can get. Like if you go to Coinbase or something like that, you have a limited number. It's not by accident. It's not that people couldn't figure out how to list the other tokens, right? In many cases, these exchanges serving U.S. persons didn't want to be registered. So they also said in this that digital tokens may be securities. Now, the Dow was a virtual investment fund. Okay, it was about as close to a typical security as you could get. This was not like a middle of the road that was very instructive in terms of figuring out, where the lines are. It basically was like, here's the continuum, and this is the one we're focusing on right over here. So for a while, lawyers and others struggled to really determine, some of them, I think, perhaps spending more attention and more struggle to determine which ones were securities and which ones were not. But basically, a lot of tokens continued to be sold broadly, and people would say, well, I have a utility token. It is not a security. So then came Munchie, and Munchie was last fall, towards the end of last fall. Now, in between these two, a few things happened. The SEC formed a cyber unit. There were a number of fraudulent token sales that were shut down. There were lots of different things that happened. And the Munchie cease and desist order was notable because it was the first time that a token sale was stopped, where there was an enforcement action about it, where there was no allegation of fraud or scam. So Munchie was a real company based in California, had an app that was supposed to be used to rank restaurant meals. And many of us in the space had been saying, listen, okay, manner of sale matters. You have to be really careful how you're talking about the token sale, how you're selling it, how your agents are selling it. And, and some of us said, look, and I'll return to Munchie in a second. Some of us said, look, when some of us buy Ether, for example, if I buy Ether, I am not using it as gas. I am not building on Ethereum, okay? I'm purchasing it because I think it will go up in value. But other people are using it as gas, right? So you can't necessarily look at all of the different people, all of the different investors, and determine whether they had an expectation of profit, right? So maybe one of the helpful things to do, and if you look at through some of the cases that have come after the Howey test, you start seeing, okay, well, manner of sale matters. It's what the issuer does also that determines whether someone had a reasonable expectation of profit. So in Munchie, they went through a few different things. Now, some of these were a surprise to many of us. For example, they looked at the white paper, and on the white paper, there was a flow chart showing that as the network grew, right, as network adoption increased, the value of the token will rise. Now that, objectively speaking, may be true, but the fact that it was shown as a flow chart showing the value increasing, the SEC said that gave a reasonable expectation of profit. They also looked and they saw that the sellers were saying, we're going to make sure that there's a secondary market for this. We're going to list it on exchanges. So they said, look, you're encouraging speculation. They also went further, though. They said, hey, you said this is for restaurant meals, but you weren't you weren't marketing to those who were interested in restaurants or to restaurants themselves. You were marketing to people who wanted to buy digital tokens. And they also went further, and I was pretty impressed by this. They found videos on YouTube where third party had posted, the token's going to go up in value. And evidently, Munchie had somehow linked, I don't know if it was through Facebook or something like that, just link to that third-party site. And the SEC said, look, you're anyway, as a takeaway, you have to police those marketing on your behalf, right? So one last thing that the SEC did say in this, they said a couple of other things quickly. One was they said this is for U.S. persons, but they were marketing everywhere, right? And then the other thing is they said they didn't have to say this. In law school, I would have said, or a professor would have said, this is dicta, right? It's not relevant to the holding. In the Munchie case, or in the Munchie token sale, the token wasn't fully functional. It wasn't going to be fully functional when it was sold. But the SEC said, even if the token had been fully functional at the moment of sale, it still could have been a security. So, a few other things. The SAFT. So, there are many different views on the SAFT. I will say that, how can I say this? There are many different views on the SAFT. I have written, along with some of my colleagues, some critiques on the form of SAFT that was launched into the marketplace. I don't think anyone should be using that particular form, and in fact, my friend who launched that form on a white paper doesn't use that form. So just, be aware of that. One of the thoughts behind the SAFT was the idea that if you wait until the token is fully functional when you sell it, then the purchaser is bearing product risk rather than enterprise risk. And that if you purchase in a pre-sale, you could have a security. You could have investors purchasing then. And then when it emerges at the end of when it's ready to go, it comes up, and there it's not a security. It can be bought by people who are accredited investors or unaccredited investors, also known as retail investors. Now, others have a view that if you are in accordance with Munchie, if you are selling a large percentage of your tokens, or if you're selling in general your tokens to people who are investing and who, in some cases, depending on the form of the SAFT, because there's no one form, if they're saying, I am purchasing solely for investment and not for use, at the end of the day, the token that you have has been sold potentially primarily to people who said they weren't going to use it. So in some ways, some people think that it was an elegant way of navigating, and others think that perhaps it actually makes things a little bit more challenging. Now, one thing is, though, what I'm seeing more often is people using SAFTs in similar vehicles followed by a security token. And for that, obviously you have to look at each individual form, but the whole risk that is concerning to some people is whether the token at the end of the day will be a security. So if you're not worried that it's going to be a security, then there may be reasons why you want to use a SAFT, right? Just want to warn of the risks about relying that the token at the end of the day would not be a security. Okay, alternative trading systems. We're beginning to see these pop up. So Templum, has launched. T0 has an alternative trading system in the works. I bring this up because I think, this is my view, and this is also what I'm seeing, is that more and more tokens are explicitly saying that they are securities. And once these platforms are up and running, I think there will be fewer people who are sort of straining to say that their token is not a security, because there will be a place for them to trade. Up until this point, if you had a token that was a security and you wanted it to be on an exchange that U.S. persons could reach it on, you couldn't do that. You had to say it wasn't a security. So I think that we will see that. I'll just step aside for a second and say I'm seeing a lot of different things, a lot of different paths. So on one hand, you've got the security token space. I even am seeing investment banks that are marketing security token sales or plan to. So there's a real professionalism of that angle. I also, on the other hand, am seeing some token sales that are being launched outside of the U.S., and they're saying we don't want it to go into the U.S. because we really believe that our token is not a security and that it doesn't work for our business model if it becomes a security, and we're just going to exclude the U.S. until we have some kind of guidance, or until, say, a lawyer on our behalf goes and speaks with the SEC, perhaps on an anonymous basis, and there's some sort of answer. right? So subpoenas, I have this here. What do we know and what are the implications? So we know that a lot of them have been sent out. They've been sent out to a number of folks across the token sale landscape. What we don't yet know, it has been said in the media that there are a number of investigations going on and potential enforcement actions. At the same time, there also, I think it's important to remember that subpoenas are the regulators' fact-finding. That's how they get information. So I don't think that just because someone may have received a subpoena that it's necessarily that they will be under some sort of enforcement action. But they are, as I understand it, prevalent in the space. Okay. So, we spend a lot of time talking about securities laws. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of these laws. But these laws exist. And as I often say, doing token sales is a team sport. So it's very important that if you are working on a token sale, even if it's just in the US, somebody needs to be advising you in all of these areas. And I don't mean somebody, one person. I mean a team. Also, there was a recent letter by FinCEN to Senator Wyden. Now this, I've noted at the top, it doesn't have the force of law. And it refers to guidance that also doesn't have the force of law. But it's important to think about why this was sent and why this reminder was put out there that many token sellers and or platforms may need to register. So these are, and I bring this up also because the Know Your Customer anti-money laundering stuff is really important. The sanctions stuff is really important. We spend so much time on securities laws. This is also important stuff. And aside from just, certain requirements as to certain kinds of businesses, there also are criminal statutes that apply with respect to, certain money laundering and the like. So federal criminal statutes, that's what I was referring to. So you've got OFAC and things like that to worry about as well. Certain non-U.S. jurisdictions. As you probably know, many of them have come out with different guidance. FINMA came out with guidance a few weeks ago that I thought was particularly interesting. They had, for example, 3 different kinds of tokens, one of which is a payment token. Wyoming, when it recently passed its 5 blockchain bills, including House Bill 70, which dealt with utility tokens, part of what the influence was for that was the FINMA guidance. So it's very interesting to see, Singapore has provided some sort of guidance about what tokens may be utility tokens and not securities. Gibraltar and certain other jurisdictions have said that they would like to be destinations for token sales, and they have certain principles that go along with it. It will be interesting to see what happens with the U.S. Now, I will mention, some jurisdictions, as you probably know, have banned token sales, including China and South Korea. Okay, so I can stop here, or I can hop ahead for a couple more minutes of selective practical considerations. Now, why do I have this in here? Okay, before I go on to the next slide, just want to paint a picture. So we talk about token sales like they're happening in a vacuum. They're not. So you could have all different kinds of companies that do token sales, right? And some of them may have existing safes. They may have convertible notes. They may have warrants and all sorts of things outstanding. They may have credit facilities in some cases. So I'll just hop to a couple things very quickly. If you are an early stage investor, you may be surprised to know or to find out, unfortunately, and maybe you're happy about this if you're an issuer, that sometimes your safes, your warrants, your convertible notes, it's not a liquidity event. It's not a trigger if you do a token sale. So if you are representing one of those folks, or if you are one of those folks, you want to closely look at your documents. Same thing if you are doing commitment papers for any type of transaction, whether it is an acquisition, whether it is a financing, or something like that. If you have exclusivity provisions, you need to make sure that they either capture or don't capture, depending on what you're going for, token sales, and don't just talk about debt and equity. Same thing if you have alternative transaction fees. A lot of them, at least in the financing space, they pick up equity and debt. They don't necessarily pick up token sales. And so in some of these things, I've included, I'll skip through some of here, in credit agreements. And before all of this, I was a leveraged finance lawyer, right? So credit agreements are near and dear to my heart. You know, determining whether, if you're a lender, you can do a token sale under a credit facility or whether it's prohibited, you have to really closely look at the documents, because in many cases it may not be clear whether a token sale is prohibited. Because what is it? Is it an issuance of equity? Is it an issuance of debt? Is it an asset sale? What is it? Is it a change of control? Is it a fundamental change? Well, it could result in a materially more risky company in some cases if you don't do your KYC AML right. You know, another thing in the DAO guidance that wasn't touched upon was the question of whether, you know, it accidentally created an investment company. The SEC didn't need to reach that because the DAO no longer existed. But if you have an agreement that says that you have a 40 Act rep and you can't be an investment company, you really need to be careful about that. Also, say you have a credit facility. How do you know? Do you have to prepay the proceeds of a token sale? Well, it depends. If you take in, well, it depends on the credit agreement, right? But it may not be debt. It may not be equity. Is it cash for an excess cash flow prepayment? Well, let's ask the accountants. I mean, if you take in money, or quote unquote money, but it's digital tokens, Bitcoin and Ether, is that cash? Is that cash for EBITDA? Is that, you know, what is it? There are so many different things like that where you really need to think through the implications. And yeah, it's a really interesting space. I'm happy to have any questions that anyone would like, and thank you for having me.
So, I mean, to
Sure.
your point, is it, if you accept digital tokens, is it income?
So I'm not an accountant. I also can't give you legal advice or accounting advice or investment advice or really any advice here. But I think it's an important question. Also, even if you can count it for EBITDA and things like that, how are you valuing this? And when are you valuing it? Is it just what it happens to be at the end of a quarter? That seems kind of crazy. You could have something happen and it suddenly is worth less than it was the day before. I guess that's always a risk with things. But I think it will be an interesting negotiation in terms of whether something is included or not.
I've seen certain companies, what they do is when they collect all their funds through the ICO, they immediately work with like a treasury department and they diversify to like lower risk assets or turn to fiat or buy real estate or something like that to kind of maintain that value. And then I guess they take it under the books after that. I'm not sure what they're doing there, but
I'm not sure about that either, but certainly if something helps you preserve the value, you know, yeah. Yes,
Thanks for the presentation. It was very informative.
pleasure.
From an entrepreneur perspective, sometimes it feels like the regulations and the things that are coming online are truly there to help protect people from fraud, from these things. And some of it feels like it's there to protect the interest of large corporations that might be losing power because of this new movement. Where do you see the line? And how do you feel like, what is the intent behind a lot of these things that are coming out?
So I mean, I'm not a regulator, okay? But I do, if I were to look at the various people I know who are involved somehow with tokens, they really run the gamut from very sophisticated investors and founders and people who are quite into the space, right? Who have been in this space for a long time, even before there was such a thing as a token sale. They were programming or something like that. Then I also see people like my mom or somebody who might, work in my building, talking about buying tokens and saying, number one, if they're my mom, how do I do it, right? And should I be doing this? And is this something I should do? Should I put my retirement in it, right? That's not a good sign. And then other people where I know that they might have a relatively small income relative to the number that they're talking about. I have heard things where people have said like, oh my gosh, I know I'm not supposed to look at this for 3 years, but I can't stop looking for 3 minutes. Like my money is gone, right? I think the regulators are in a tough spot, because this is an important innovation, right? And nobody wants to stop it. But there are people out there who do not know when a scam is approaching them. They do not realize it. And I think that's one of the challenging things. And what I hope we'll see is now a maturing of the space. Because I think all of us, if you're an entrepreneur and you have a real great product, I don't think you want to be associated with the scams, right? So I think finding out, I think the regulators, I can't speak for them obviously, but I do truly believe they're trying to figure out a way to address the bad and somehow preserve the good. But, they're, as I said, they're in kind of a tough spot. I do totally hear what you're saying, though. I think sometimes, and I think this will be part 2 of how we figure it out, right? Because we're going one step at a time. But if we make everything a security, well, then, does that mean that you have to, as my friend Caitlin often says, does that mean that you have to open up a Schwab account to use a coin that would allow you as a photographer to upload a photograph? Well, that seems kind of like an absurd result, So I think we're going to figure it out, but I do think that what is being done now is partly out of caution. And I will note that both with Munchie and with the DAO, no one was quote unquote punished. Munchie had to give back the money, and it's probably a little bit embarrassing now that it's known, as that. But nothing, these were warnings. And so I think to the extent that we can move forward and kind of clear out some of the clearly bad actors and have some sort of framework for how these proceed, it will help all of us.
In your experience, what use cases have you seen that are just straight up clear-cut utility tokens and not securities?
So I probably can't, I'm limited in what I can say because I am employed, and we do have risk management protocols. I will say, though, that when I see something that is truly a protocol that people are going to use, this makes me think that it looks in some ways sometimes less like a security than, say, somebody who literally has an operating business and they're trying to raise money for their business and they've decided, and I don't think it's a bad thing to monetize goodwill, right? And to say that something may increase in value. But I see a lot of tack-on tokens that are not somehow related to blockchain. And I think those that truly are related to blockchain, I think many of them are, in my view, looking less like securities, with the understanding that the SEC has said, or rather the chairman has said, that he has not seen a token that doesn't have the hallmarks of a security. So, okay. Yes?
Yeah, I have another question. What do you see in the future of unaccredited foreign investors investing in U.S. companies? How will the U.S. regulations look at that scenario?
So, I'm not sure exactly what the U.S. regulations will do and what the U.S. regulators will do in the future. I do think, though, that, and this is my personal view, again, nothing I'm saying is my employer's view or anyone else's view, certainly not the regulator's view. But I do think that there is an understanding that we don't want all technological innovation and all ownership of these entities to go overseas. I mean, I think people do want to preserve the innovation and to have, U.S. persons not be completely excluded. But I mean, frankly, right now I am seeing a lot of projects where it's not necessarily a U.S. person launching the token sale, but people forming, say, a Swiss foundation and then only selling to people who are not U.S. persons under the securities laws.
Sounds like you're going to double the size of your law firm.
But it's pretty exciting because it's not just token sales, right? There's all of blockchain. And there's smart contracts. There's so many different things. There are exchanges coming online. There are these platforms. There are just many, many different things. To me, it's like the most exciting point in my career ever. I was never this excited about leveraged finance, I've got to say. But all right, well, thank all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.